Hello and welcome back to Hypatia's Lantern. So that last video got quite a bit of a response. At the very least, I'm happy that it's gotten some people to think and have some discussions. I'm trying to keep this under 20 minutes, so if I don't get through everything today, there will be a short part 3 where I respond to the comments. Before I begin, allow me to point you towards Econoboy. It will be linked in the comments. If you're looking for empirical data-based arguments on economic and social issues, that is the place to be. So without much further ado, let's return to free speech. The right often likes to malign safe spaces. Okay, but let's dissect what a safe space is. The basic definition of a safe space is a space in which a person often, but not always, of a minority identity can feel like they're not going to be harassed, verbally attacked or abused when either being themselves or when discussing issues that predominantly affect their particular grouping. These spaces are often necessary because, in many instances, minorities who speak out about issues that predominantly affect them, from racism to sexism to transphobia, are frequently attacked and shouted down. When you're not part of the dominant narrative, bringing up an issue that contradicts it or doesn't fit within it can be exceedingly difficult. This is not something that is restricted just to the right, as those who attempted to combat anti-Semitism within the Labour Party found out during the Corbyn era, or perhaps systemic sexism within many revolutionary socialist movements, such as the Socialist Workers' Party and the mishandling of sexual assault allegations. Frequently, safe spaces are applied to university campuses. During the undertaking of my degree, some of my seminars on political philosophy were classed as safe spaces, so that we could express our ideas from our own lived and perceived experience and understanding of the issues without fear of harassment or judgment. This was obviously an enhancement of free speech. It allowed people who wouldn't ordinarily express ideas the space and the comfort with which to express them. It's an obvious and tangible benefit. Naturally, there are drawbacks to safe spaces. I've seen it expressed that it is a clumsy attempt at creating areas where discussion can occur without the implicit violence within speech. However, there are some issues with safe spaces. How do you define what is safe? It's a tough line to take, as is the difficulty of the trigger warning issue. Safe spaces are, in my opinion, a net positive, but without a proper, careful and nuanced take on what is and isn't appropriate, it can be very easy to create an almost oppressive echo chamber which prevents free thought. This, I think, is a result of a poorly expressed concern by those who attempt to challenge the existence of safe spaces on university campuses. But don't let that fool you. When a right-winger such as Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson start going off about snowflakes in their safe spaces, what they're really talking about are students trying to be mindful that our speech can cause harm, that we need to be mindful of the fact that there are voices that should be heard but aren't because ignorance still cuts deep and can hurt even when unintentional. It also segs quite nicely into a slightly different conversation about free speech and the need to be able to cut out non-factual speech. Now, I hope that this channel has attracted people on the right because I want them to be able to listen to these arguments and consider different points of view, so feel free to put these videos in right-leaning spaces. Donald Trump is a liar. I don't think even his most ardent supporters can deny that. He has a very loose relationship with the truth. He has the right to say what he wishes. He has the free right to lie to the country. But is this just? Is it appropriate for politicians to be able to tell not only implied falsehoods, but outright falsehoods? Especially when it impacts the way we vote. This is quite an ironic point, I feel, as I drafted this episode prior to the Parler takedown, in which many of the free speech activists found companies were no longer willing to host Parler on their services for violations of terms and conditions, which, according to their conception of a free market, is perfectly legitimate. In the Brexit referendum, both Leave campaigns were notorious for telling a number of mistruths or misrepresenting facts to such an unprecedented degree that the independent UK Statistics Authority rebuked them at one point for using a misleading figure repeatedly. This is not something new. The Scottish National Party did the same thing in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. David Cameron did the same in conflating debt and deficit in 2010. This goes back a long way. You can even find clips of Ronald Reagan inventing stories of welfare queens driving Cadillacs paid for by the taxpayer. In the words of Mark Twain, a lie will have made itself halfway around the world before the truth has even got its shoes on. Previously, we were protected by a robust and more independent-minded media, but old conventions are falling apart, and as the media has become more partisan, our constitutional conventions are fraying. This is not a small issue. I touched upon it on previous videos, but the situation is stark. These lies play an active role in determining how the populace votes. When Donald Trump tells the nation undocumented immigrants bring nothing but crime and drugs and drain the economy, that matters. It causes a tangible effect. When the Daily Mail tells its readers that benefit fraud is rampant, it sticks in the minds of voters. Now, it's very easy to prove that undocumented immigrants commit less crimes and contribute a net plus to the US economy. It's very easy to check the UK government figures that find that benefit fraud is absurdly low, so much so that it's getting to the point where attempting to channel more resources into solving the issue will not be cost effective because it will cost so much more than we could ever claw back. So when the media or politicians bang this drum repeatedly and exaggerate the issue, we start to run into a situation where we need to ask, is it a reasonable limit on free speech to prevent this sort of behaviour? It's a yes and no situation, because we run into the thorny issue of what truth, whose truth, and who is to determine the truth. Truth can depend on where you stand. It can be very easy for truth to be manufactured in situations of uncertainty, and almost all postmodernists would tell you that there is no one empirical truth, only many truths. And to a point, for a lot of social issues and political issues, that is the case. A lot of today's politicians are very canny in that they don't blatantly lie. They attach a counterfactual interpretation to a kernel of truth and use that as their vehicle of deception. They can't technically be called liars because at the very base root there will be some element of truth. That is, unless you're Donald Trump or Boris Johnson and it doesn't matter to you if people figure out you're lying. In addition to this, having a governmental organisation or an independent organisation that acts almost as a ministry of truth is just begging to collapse into an authoritarian nightmare. It also compromises on that essential right to dissent and disagree. In terms of extents, it's very hard to get the dividing line on this issue right. And yet, we simply cannot continue on as we are. We are witnessing, as we speak, a crisis of confidence and a crisis of information. Traditional sources of information have been undermined and overwhelmed to the point where they are compromising on their journalistic standards in an attempt to follow the views. Case in point being Fox News. There is no right answer here. It's a murky and nebulous affair. I tend to rely on deeply evidenced journalistic sources, but that takes time and effort that not everyone has. Sometimes I think that the rolling news is the issue, because there is a constant pressure to say something, to maintain viewers over a longer period of time, as opposed to just the 10 PM news or hourly updates. It's also really important to note that our conception of free speech overwhelmingly benefits older white men, who make up the dominant group in our society. They are the wealthiest slice of voters, the most consistent voters, and the ones with the least to gain and the most to lose. Changes to our understanding of free speech would ask the most of that demographic more than any other, because the language that we use now in civil society is determined most by that group. When you consider that the right to offend is used mostly by this demographic, and when you consider that the right to free speech is most zealously protected when it is this group's speech, and when you consider that this group is also some of the most zealous in clamping down on speech they consider outside the accepted group, a bleak picture emerges, where the right to free speech is no longer universal, but instead tacitly qualified. In no way, shape or form could Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Elizabeth Warren get away with some of the sort of language you regularly hear from Lindsey Graham or Josh Hawley or other white male GOP members. In no way, shape or form could someone like Diane Abbott get away with the comments made by Malcolm Gove or Jacob Rees-Mogg. When we talk about free speech, we have to be mindful of the fact that speech is both a fundamental right at the very heart of who we are as a people, but also that our speech has effects, our words have weight. We frequently hear the refrain that the pen is mightier than the sword, and though people like to laugh at that, it is true. If you read across the long stretches of recorded history, it's startling how many conflicts began because someone gave offence by being careless with their speech or provoked populations to anger by not caring what they were saying. You only need to look at the career of Boris Johnson, who has made his ambition to be Prime Minister on the back of lying and misrepresenting the European Union. The United Kingdom now faces a devastating economic blow because he used his words in a flippant way and did not care or consider the consequences, only his own ambition. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister for Propaganda in Nazi Germany, understood this all too clearly. He's infamous for saying that if you make the lie big and you repeat it enough, it will be believed. Nowhere is this more clear than on vaccines. The big lie is that vaccines cause autism or somehow cause damage in children. There has been zero credible scientific evidence to back this up, but the vaccine denial industry has made the big lie and have stuck to it and profited from it. This is protected under free speech, and yet it is causing an increasing public health crisis. Measles cases are rising and causing active damage to children, and yet they continue with their denial of basic science. In lieu of an answer, because really there isn't an answer, I will give my own take on the limits of free speech. I believe we're entering a new social dynamic, where we aim to be more inclusive towards the minorities of our society. Frequently, the existing limits of our free speech were defined in two separate ways. Under the premises of the dominant groupings, we accepted that we could freely, that is, legally, say almost anything, and social pressure takes care of what isn't acceptable. For example, it isn't acceptable for a US politician to say that the United States is not the greatest country in the world. Oh, for sure, they're legally free to say it, but the social pressure prevents it. We are now seeing a redefining of that social pressure. It is being used to attack speech that is overtly hostile to minorities without cause. It's attempting to apply a new standard of politeness and acceptability, but in doing so towards the minority groups instead of the dominant. And as I alluded to earlier, that is the big issue. It's preventing age-old norms from continuing as the norm, and that is deeply uncomfortable for people. Many people don't like to think of themselves as racist or sexist or transphobic, and so on. So when confronted by the fact that a word that they have always used or an idea they have always believed since childhood is now one of those things, it gives them the idea that they're being called a racist, and so on. And that provokes a big reaction. I also feel like many activists who are in the know aren't always the best at articulating to people who aren't in the know in a way that people can follow. A good example of this is a few months back, a friend of mine who is not into politics like I am, he's a builder, sent a video of a person who gave a rhyming speech. It was his complaint about his speech, in essence. He was saying things like, I'm not a racist for wanting my community to be of my people, or sexist, and so on and so on and so on. I know many people who would agree, and I've spoken to many more who follow that exact sentiment. And this is the thing, despite the things that he is saying being racist, being sexist, being Islamophobic, it isn't necessarily the case that they are being intentionally so. This is difficult. It isn't an easy line to draw. After all, how do you distinguish between people who simply don't understand how something is racist to people who know and are attempting to dog whistle or slide by? A good example of this is gender essentialism. Many people would agree that men and women are fundamentally different in what they like and what they're good at, even though we know it stems from socialization, i.e. that the way we're brought up tends to prejudge us and push us towards those things. Are they being sexist by agreeing? Yes. Do I think they're hardcore sexists? No. To understand many of these ideas, many of these concepts, is not as simple as don't be a hater. It requires effort, time and understanding. A lot of people won't have that time, effort or ability to understand often dry academic texts. There is a disconnect between what we know academically and what people know socially. Until we can find a way to bridge that gap, these issues will persist. Until activists who understand can communicate these ideas to people, these issues will persist. Now let me be clear, this isn't to be condescending, and I don't think it's right for people who do understand to try and talk down to people. It's a conversation, it's a discussion, a dialogue where people can feel free and safe to express their concepts and puzzle things out. You're not their teacher, you're a sounding board. Part of why I started this channel is to help be that sounding board for other people, to shine a light on these issues and help people think beyond the reactionary slogans we see in society. To conclude, I would say this: our current regime for governing speech is inadequate. The old enlightenment principles, whilst valid, are fraying as the loopholes and gaps are being exploited, and whilst the paradigm is changing, we need to ask ourselves who our laws protect, who our laws help, and how our speech, policed either through law or through social pressure, needs to adapt and grow. The general principle by which I operate and which helps me regulate my speech is thus: the question is never can I, it is should I. I think it's always important to be judicious in how you approach your speech, in choosing your moments and in seeking to be conciliatory rather than incendiary, diplomatic rather than reckless foolhardy. But beyond that, it's a conversation we together must have and look at how we can make our right to freedom of speech work for all segments of society, not just a few. So on that note, have a good think about free speech. What are your limits? How do you define what speech is acceptable? Let me know in the comments, and remember to head across to Econoboy and take a look at his content. Thank you and goodbye.